Okay, hello everyone. Why are you indoors right now? Okay, it's pastoral in Chicago, and we're in a place in social history in which people from St. Louis come to Chicago to escape various urban civil disabilities. So anyway, yeah, well, we could talk about that for an hour, but I won't. I won't. Okay. So I'd like to start with an epigraph in the form of a poem by Richard Wright. Richard Wright, as you know, is the author of the famous naturalist novel Native Son. But I believe that this text is in fact just as important in the definition of modern African-American literature, and it's called the FBI Blues. That old FBI tied a bell to my bedstall, said old FBI tied a bell to my bedstall. Each time I love my baby, government knows it all. I'm not very good at reading these kinds of poems, but okay, I'm from New Jersey. Woke up, we didn't really have the blues in New Jersey. Woke up this morning, FBI under my bed. Said I woke up this morning, FBI under my bed. Told me all I dreamed last night, every word I said. Everywhere I look, Lord, I see FBIs. Said every place I look, Lord, I find FBIs. I'm getting sick and tired of government spies. Okay, can you see that? The man on the right is the one in question, William C. Sullivan. So the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the most storied name in U.S. law enforcement, capped its long struggle against African-American protest with a homemade imitation of black prose. Late in the evening of November 20th, 1964, FBI Assistant Director William C. Sullivan, a former English teacher who still dreamed of a professorship at a snug New England college, fed a sheet of unwatermarked paper into a worn-down, untraceable typewriter. Both items were common tools of the trade within domestic intelligence, the Bureau division where Sullivan held sway. Then, as now, the Bureau's mission was twofold: to enforce U.S. federal laws and to protect U.S. national security. Inside Sullivan's domestic intelligence division, however, security trumped law. Secretive counterintelligence, the effort to mislead enemies by mimicking or otherwise hijacking their trusted sources of information, overshadowed above-board crime fighting. By devoting his literary ambition to the covert art of counterintelligence, the Irish-American House, and you know what? I'm having trouble reading this for various reasons. Would you like to talk about it? Okay, let's talk about it. What do you want to know about the 51 FBI files that I have received? I could continue to talk about this at great length, but let's. Okay. Okay, there are several reasons why I went to that place. I'm a child of the 1970s. So for me, the FBI was both something I desired and something I feared. Okay. My father was a bit of a campus radical who thought that the FBI was watching him. Unfortunately, it was not. Which I discovered late in my life. I actually requested his file fairly recently. This is in the long line of requests that I made after I discovered that Claude McKay, the famous Harlem Renaissance poet, had an extensive FBI file that contained both aesthetic evaluation of his poems, but then also political commentary. And the FBI was involved in various ways in monitoring his travels to the Soviet Union. This is quite early on. This is from 1922 to 1923. So I discovered that file, and I determined that it was worth checking on essentially the filed status of everyone in the African-American canon, all of the modern writers who now make the tradition. So I began writing away for FBI files of all sorts. This is around 2006. It's a long time ago now. So This is under the moment of the Bush administration. There is some resistance at the FBI, but not too much, and reams of materials come in. So I request 106 files altogether, 51 arrive, and it's everyone from Claude McKay to Langston Hughes to Richard Wright to Chicago's own Lorraine Hansberry to Alice Childress to many of the writers of the Black Arts Movement. So the FBI is not only writing the sort of letter I began to talk about to Martin Luther King, but also engaging with Black writing beneath it. So what I was interested in looking at was the way in which the FBI began to act like a literary critic. Many of these files involve moments where you have a would-be surveyor or censor fall into a text. So there's an identification on the part of FBI readers with these documents early on. So here's one story. There's Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun. It's coming down the pike. It's coming to Broadway. It's the first play by a Black woman that's produced on Broadway as a first-run feature. But in 1958, it's premiering in Philadelphia. The FBI sends an agent to review the play. The original purpose is to discover if there's communist content, but that very quickly turns out to be negligible. So the agent then writes a very good 5-page paper on A Raisin in the Sun. And that's indicative to me of a whole relationship in which you have FBI readers, some of whom are trained as English majors, fall into identification with the text, and produce a relationship between the state and between Black writing that's more than just negation or attack. So that's the essence of this. But what else do you want to know about it?
Go back to, you started with that, and you said about Martin Luther King. You never...
Yes, no, I didn't finish doing that. I broke that down. Yeah, so Sullivan writes this letter to King, this famous letter to King, in which he suggests essentially that King has 34 days left, right? This is an anonymous letter. It's meant to destroy Martin Luther King's life, okay? Excuse me? This is 1964. This is 1964. But what's fascinating about that is that the letter is written in a Black voice. It's written in the guise of a Black writer. And so I tried to look at the history beneath that to determine what's going on. So the FBI's opposition to African American protest was attached to both a fear of and an appreciation for African American expression, African American literature. That's the idea. So. Yes?
You referred to the agents being English majors.
Some of them were, not all.
Training all from us English professors, or was Sullivan and the FBI giving them direction on how to do literary criticism?
Yeah, so what was well, most FBI agents were either lawyers or trained in insurance, okay? Some were involved in accounting, okay? But they would therefore come to the Bureau with a graduate degree and a smattering of English classes behind them. So they brought the assumptions of American literary criticism along with them when they got to the Bureau. So in the post-World War I period, there's much more attention to this particular language of Black texts. It looks a little bit like the new criticism. And some of you may know that the CIA itself was staffed in its counterintelligence wing by a lot of ex-new critics. Okay? That's in part because the head of CIA counterintelligence was a man named James Jesus Angleton, who was not only fascinated with the new criticism, but helped to produce one of its founding journals, Furioso. So when it comes to the CIA's involvement in the world of literature, you have these efforts to convert the European intelligentsia through the Congress for Cultural Freedom and other things. When it comes to the FBI, you have people picking up on that, but FBI literary criticism, which is the fruit of a much earlier engagement from 1919 into the 1920s, that looks a lot more like standard historical or biographical criticism. So you also have supervising editors at the Bureau who were ex-graduate students in English. William C. Sullivan is one, the man who wrote the infamous letter to King. But there's also an earlier character named Robert Adger Bowen, who was a graduate student at Cornell. So that's the. What was the point? Okay. The point initially is to discover evidence of sedition, right? You all know the Sedition Act of 1918 makes writing against the government, the flag, etc., essentially illegal. So the initial impetus is to discover evidence of sedition. Once that wanes, though, in the 1920s, the habits are there of this kind of close reading, and it extrapolates into many different other areas. So.
Was there much action taken as a result, like against any of the writers as a result of these close readings, or did they ever?
There's not a lot of post-publication censorship. I don't find evidence of that. But the writers, many of them were quite conscious about this interference. Richard Wright was convinced that he was not only chased by the FBI once he got to Europe in the post-World War II period. There were some theories among other black expatriates that he was actually murdered by the FBI. I find no evidence for that. So there wasn't outright censorship, there wasn't post-publication censorship, but there was certainly an effort to sort of engage with the mind of black writing as it's being produced.
How did they become aware of them, the black community?
Yeah, how did the writers know? Some were interviewed by FBI agents. When guys with badges show up at your door, you tend to know that. So Richard Wright was interviewed by FBI agents. Lorraine Hansberry certainly was. Claude McKay was very aware that he couldn't return to the United States until FBI agents removed themselves from the various ports of entry. So there's that kind of information. It gets passed down through the tradition. So, my point in part is that this is a literary culture, right, that is producing documents at moments in which it knows it's being observed or surveyed by the FBI. We're not talking about people being clapped into jail, but we're talking about a heavy influence.
Any evidence of it occurring with other ethnic groups?
That's a good question. I have not examined that myself, but I think some writers imagined that the Latino left in the 1960s was being monitored in the same way. But for the FBI, race in America was very much a black and white story. And that has to do with Hoover's own orientation, his coming up in segregated Washington, D.C., at the turn of the century. So.
What was the time period covered by these files, and why did you select that time period?
Right. Well, the files that I selected were all from the 1919 to 1972 period, which also happens to be the time of J. Edgar Hoover's lifespan. Okay, at the FBI. All right. He's born in 1895. 1919 to 1972 is the Hoover era, and it's also exactly the same era as some of the most important movements in black literature. 1919 might be the first year of the Harlem Renaissance. It's the first year of Hoover's relationship to the Bureau. 1972 might be the height of the black arts movement. It's also the moment of Hoover's death in office. So this is very much an affair of the Hooverite FBI, as I understand it.
Would you explain a little more about exactly what was in that letter to Martin Luther King?
Sure.
You left it a little vague.
Yes, I probably did, yeah. It's a letter that suggests that the bearer commits suicide, potentially, or perhaps not pick up the Nobel Prize. There's this guarantee that in 34 days, a definite end will come. So it's ambivalent, but it's also malicious. So we're talking about, the primary agency of American state intelligence during that period for domestic intelligence, directly targeting the most important head of the civil rights movement.
What did King do?
King, that's a good question. King became depressed, right, upon receipt of the letter. We know this, ironically, because the FBI recorded his reaction. Okay. There are bugs, right? There are bugs in hotel rooms that also catch him in his extramarital affairs, but there are telephone bugs that pick up his own reaction to this letter and the receipt of this letter.
Did he assume it was from the FBI?
Yes, they knew immediately. It was the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference Brain Trust, got together and analyzed this letter as a group. It was like a group literary criticism moment. Coretta Scott King was there, who had opened the package. But King was quite certain it was the FBI. They assumed that only the FBI had the technological capacity and the malice in combination to produce this, and they were absolutely right. But what's, for me, that's one of the tragic moments of modern American history. It's the nadir of FBI history. But it's also a moment that encapsulates the level of fascination with black writing because it's written in a black voice. You would do that as a counterintelligence exercise. But it's also being done as a reflection of Sullivan's own interest in African American expression. During the COINTELPRO, right, moment, which comes a bit later, you have many African American voices being imitated and produced by FBI agents who are trying to disrupt the Black Power and Black Arts movement. So Sullivan's writing in a kind of minstrelized black voice becomes par for the course at the FBI for many years, through 1972, when COINTELPRO is destroyed.
Did Hoover, was he aware of what Sullivan was doing?
Yes, oh yes, very much so. I mean, Sullivan was his third lieutenant, I think, in line, and in charge of his reaction to African American life and letters. So Hoover approved of this, right, at some distance, at some certifiable distance. But Sullivan was working within his
It's all
ambit.
malicious, but it sounds an awful lot like a death threat.
Well, that's pretty malicious.
The federal government is sending out a death threat to
An agency of the federal government writing in secret is sending out a death threat to Martin Luther King, yes. I thought that this letter was fairly well known, right? It's sort of, no? Okay. It's in the National Archives if you'd like to see it for yourself. Okay, yeah.
Mr. Maxwell?
Yeah.
Okay, so if the FBI was acting as a literary critic and it's examining African American literature,
Right.
did you find any evidence that literature that they thought was excessively undermining or excessively encouraging people to protest, right, or to challenge the status quo, that they then convinced maybe well-known literary critics for other publications to
Right.
slam those pieces or publishers not to publish those works? And if you did find that, do you think the FBI is still doing this with certain artists today?
No, I don't think so. This is a pretty terrible history, but it's also a terrible history that reflects a sense of literature's great importance, which has waned, right? I mean, thank you for support. You don't censor something you think is bootless or powerless. So I think that we are being read all the time, but we're being read in aggregate by the agencies of the state. I mean, the NSA is not reading individual literary works. It's checking for great patterns of metadata, right? It's not interested in literature as a single word. Hoover was fascinated by the power of the literary word for several reasons. One is that when he gets to the Bureau in 1919, there isn't a national radio program. There's certainly not television. There is not the FBI at the movies, which became a regular sort of staple on Saturday mornings in the 1930s. There's just literature. There are newspaper reports. And Hoover is tasked with building up the national reputation of an organization that needs to justify itself to a relatively under-policed country, right? We didn't have a national police force before the FBI, which is invented in 1908 before his coming to the Bureau. So, but remind me of the rest of the question.
It was just if you saw any evidence that the FBI influenced critics to slam certain plays or to slam...
Well, certainly they influenced like Walter Winchell and other columnists. There were many people in the American entertainment industry and the newspaper industry who were on what is sometimes called the special correspondence list, which meant that you would be given favored leaks by the FBI. If you were asked to attack a book attacking the FBI, I mean, the FBI was interested in finding traces of subversion, but also particularly blows to its own reputation. It hated the latter maybe more than the former. So if you were going to publish an anti-FBI book, as this man named Lowenthal did in 1950. The Bureau would contact publishers. It had sources at publishers. It knew that this would be coming out. Mr. Lowenthal's book was actually seized on the way to the publisher from a motorcycle sidecar, as far as we know. So there is no attempt to communicate with the high-level agencies of American literary criticism. The CIA would do that, right? That was the CIA's business. The FBI was interested in literary popularity of different sorts. So it had lots of ties in the American newspaper journalism world, but not to producers of literature per se. So.
What happened to that book?
What happened to what?
How was that book reviewed?
Some of it was reviewed positively in, say, The Nation, that part of the world. It was reviewed quite negatively in many other places, right? The FBI apparently tried to seize copies of it from libraries until someone informed this ambitious agent who came up with this plan that the libraries would buy new copies, thereby increasing sales. So. So there are elements of humor, there are elements of tragedy here. I think that one takeaway, so to speak, is the fact that you have deep fascination on the part of one of our two major American intelligence services with both, Black literature's power, its danger in its own imagination, and finally an identification with some of its authors, right? Both on the critical side and on Hoover's own side, who himself published many books. He didn't write them, but he did publish them. He had a dedicated staff that wrote them. So.
Did any of the agents identify with literary merit of some of the work?
Oh yeah. Yes. Well, for instance, I mentioned briefly the Lorraine Hansberry story, right? The reviewer who goes and who is there to discover quantities of communist infiltration, quickly dispenses with that, and then writes this very good paper. He also sort of begins to identify with specific characters, right? There's a Beneatha in the play who needs to choose among different suitors, and you see him position himself in relationship to her. So, like Madame Bovary, c'est moi. This is, Beneatha, c'est moi among this critic. So there's that. There's, even in the earliest days, this first, I guess you might call supervising critic at the FBI, Robert Adger Bowen. In 1919, 1920, he's reading Claude McKay, he's reading Langston Hughes, and others, and he does his political part, but he also, for his own use, and I found evidence of this in his papers, for his own use, he clips out the poems of Claude McKay, places them in his scrapbook, and imitates them. Okay, so in many walks of American life, we've seen how a sort of fear of blackness coexists with an identification with it, right? This is an old tale. But here we see it at the heart of the FBI and its own reaction to American culture, which seems important to me and relatively unknown. So.
As a follow-up, have you seen any tensions among them? Like was there tension within the FBI itself about those who were softening and those that were really hardcore against?
You're talking about in relationship to the entire, right. Well, there are moments when the FBI is a relatively progressive institution, given the full reign of American politics in the 20th century. In fact, Hoover himself came into office at the FBI as a capital P progressive, somebody involved with a rational approach to police administration, somebody who was going to stamp out corruption, someone who was going to display moral probity of all sorts. In the 1930s, the FBI was a major part of the New Deal. It's one of its major symbols, right, for the power of the state to crush various American evils. So there are moments when there are agents who identify with the civil rights movement and want to support it. William C. Sullivan, who wrote the letter to King that I began with in a fractured way, but I did begin there. Anyway, he thought he was doing the civil rights movement a favor. He thought that perhaps King should be replaced by Roy Wilkins or a more conservative member of the old NAACP. So what I mean to emphasize there is that sometimes the agents don't know quite what side they're on, but they were on many sides during the 20th century. The stereotype is that the FBI generally was a Republican organization, the CIA a surprisingly liberal organization, but that is in fact a stereotype. During the 1930s, Hoover was deeply identified with the Democratic Party. During the Cold War, he moved to the Republicans. He loved FDR because FDR loved his gossip and loved the power of the state. And you know, given the kinds of things that I think I've discovered about the FBI, the Federal Writers Project is not that different from the FBI. It's a state organization to bring writing into the home of American politics. So. Yes.
I have to say, I came here wanting to get a background on what you're talking about, but I'm only getting it in bits and pieces from the questions being asked of you.
Right.
So I'm hoping this question will make some sense.
Good.
I'm trying to figure out who knew in the black community, the writers,
Yes.
what was happening or got some sense of it, and what kind of chilling effect it may have had on their ability to express themselves freely.
Right.
And how this may have affected our whole culture.
That's an excellent question. It's a central question. Almost everyone who the FBI was surveying, right, within the modern black literary tradition, Richard Wright, not Zora Neale Hurston, she's not one of the people who has a file, Lorraine Hansberry, Amiri Baraka, many of the writers of the Black Arts Movement. They were all very aware that the FBI is watching. Now, it's very hard to measure evidence of what does not get on the page. It's hard to measure evidence of what does not happen. So I tried to avoid that and instead emphasize moments when black writers write back at the Bureau. And there are many of those. In the 1960s, there's a whole genre of poems that attack Hoover. I call them Hoover poems, brilliantly. But Amiri Baraka has a poem, you know, 3 movements, and a coda in which he talks about J. Edgar Hoover will soon be dead, the shadow will soon be dead, your mother will soon be dead. All the icons of American white identity will go by the boards. So what I choose to measure is traces of black writers' active response to the Bureau. And there are many. I mean, many of you have probably read Invisible Man, yes? Okay. One of the penultimate drafts of Invisible Man has the Invisible Man imagining that he's a G-man, okay? Imagining that he's an FBI agent, identifying with the sort of mask of American integrity that the G-man supposedly is involved with, right? Some of these things get trimmed away or not quite published. James Baldwin, for years, threatened a book called The Blood Counters, which was going to be an expose of the FBI, which the FBI tracked relentlessly. I don't know if James Baldwin ever planned to finally finish this work, but he knew that because the FBI is checking him out constantly, stopping his travel at moments, that the mere word that he was going to be responding in this way would have a specific effect. So it is hard for me to say exactly what was not written in relationship to this surveillance, but I can tell you about some of the things that were written. And they're pretty bold in their defiance. And there's a sort of back and forth notification. I know you're watching me. If you're watching me again, I'm watching you as well, right? And it goes back and forth across the century.
And was anybody supporting them in the wider community? Any white writers or media or?
The FBI?
No, the black, those who were being watched by the FBI.
Yeah, I mean, how supportive is the white left of this? The white left has its own problems with the FBI, of course. In the 1960s, there's a general agreement that both the New Left and the black arts are being, commonly targeted. So there's that. Are there attempts to rescue black writing in some way? I don't think it needed to be rescued, but there's general awareness. It's not something that's spoken about all that commonly outside of these works. There are many other issues, right, that African American writers were dealing with during this period. So, yes.
When Hoover died, how long did it take for this to change?
Oh, okay. Well, it changes even in part before Hoover dies. There was a very good book that was published in January about the Media, Pennsylvania burglary. Do you guys know about this? Okay. a bunch of new leftists, ex-weathermen and others, who raided an FBI agency or archive, right, in Pennsylvania in 1971, knowing that if they got into the files, they would find evidence of these counterintelligence programs. They dragged lots of papers out. They were never caught, many of them. They've only confessed to their full participation in the last several months, right? They're somewhat aged now, not all of them, but many of them are. So that's in 1971. Word of that gets back to the Bureau quickly. By that point, Hoover is more and more worried about Sullivan's tendencies to, let's just say, become excessive. So Hoover ends the program, at least what we can tell of the COINTELPRO and all sorts, right before his death. And then his death in 1972 pretty much puts the nail in the coffin, as far as I can tell.
Did the type of literary criticism that went on in the FBI change over time, like during the McCarthy years? And was how that institution thought available to you? Could you talk to any of these people?
I did visit the FBI, the big, isn't that wonderful?
Did you find out anything interesting about self-censorship in the FBI in terms of black novelists writing about sexual topics?
Okay. Well, the FBI's relationship to, let's just say, forms of sexuality is itself complicated, right? Because of Hoover, who I actually don't know about his own sexual practices, but he was in a long-standing, very strong gay marriage, right, for about 40 years with a man named Clyde Tolson. What the effect of that is on all this, I'm not absolutely certain. Is there a certain quality of African-American literary criticism that shifts over time? Yes, it does. During the period in which I was talking about earlier, in which you have new criticism sort of seep into the American Academy after World War II and seep into FBI practice, you have an engagement with the language of the text that's far more direct. There are attempts to get stanza breaks correctly when things are being replicated in FBI documents. There's a surprising attention to the fidelity of the literary text within FBI files, right? Many of which you can find online, in fact. So there's a shift that's in general in relationship to styles of academic criticism during this period. From 1919 up to the 1970s, you can map the FBI's reading more or less directly in relationship to the history of American academic criticism.
Did the program really end when Hoover wanted it to end?
As far as I know. But
Did Sullivan try and undermine that or keep going because he'd been so involved for so long?
As far as I know, no. Yes, I don't believe that Sullivan took it forward. I mean, would there be evidence of single operations, right, against singular authors? There could be. I haven't checked for that. But. Yes.
Was the FBI's actions against some of the black writers, like Richard Wright, and his then going over to France to become an expatriate, was that the main reason that he went?
Oh, okay.
And did the FBI continue to needle them while they were?
Yes, they did. They continued to needle them while they were in France, right? Wright goes in the late 1940s for a number of different reasons. I think that he feels as if the field of American race relations has become too virulent, that it's impossible to create in that atmosphere. But he also believes rightly that he's been trailed by the FBI. The FBI's file on Wright begins in 1942. You have a citizen who writes in complaining about Wright books. They instigate a major investigation of all of his work. You would assign authors to read the whole canon, right, which you would take out of the public library or buy at bookstores. Wright is very aware of FBI surveillance, even in the early 1940s. I have not found direct evidence of him saying, I need to leave the FBI behind to escape with. Early years in France, the FBI is not deeply involved, right? The CIA is being sort of percolated into existence in the late 1940s. Hoover and the FBI loathed the CIA from the very beginning because it's a threat to their power. And because this is something many people don't know about the FBI. The FBI was in charge of Southern Hemisphere intelligence during World War II. It was an international intelligence organization for several years. Hoover was not going to let that go. But in the late 1950s, early 1960s, when the CIA is very involved with the Congress of Cultural Freedom and efforts to win back the European intelligentsia, the FBI's surveillance of black literary Paris becomes fairly acute as well, convincing many of the authors involved, William Gardner Smith, James Baldwin, Chester Himes, Richard Wright, and some lesser figures, that their attempt to build a black identity on the basis of an expatriated city is being threatened as well. So the FBI's influence, right, sort of exceeds the grasp of some of the writers who were attempting to flee from it, at least imaginatively. There were FBI legats, as they were called, legal attaché agents in all of these European capitals, especially Paris. So, other things. Yes?
On shifting gear, was
Okay.
there any evidence of, or have you looked at the evidence of their influence in Hollywood and other media?
Yes, well, the FBI discovered, despite itself, that its really sort of staid look, which became an official agent uniform in the 1930s, the black suit, the absolutely, crisp white shirt. So, though it sort of represented complete anonymity, but it also became a kind of style icon. And a number of Hollywood studios produced films like G-Men, Your FBI, right? You can imagine, just put the names in a machine and you can generate all the variations. The FBI began to realize the propaganda importance of this, lent lots of advice, studio advisors and others, and collaborated with Hollywood to burnish its own image as an adjunct of the New Deal in the 1930s. There were campaigns, too, to survey much of the American entertainment industry, and one person who was involved with this was, have you heard of Ronald Reagan? Ronald Wilson Reagan. There's some good writing on that as well. So I don't study that part of it to a great extent. But the FBI, despite the fact that it's very, very serious about all forms of American media, never abandons a sense of the primacy of the written document. Hoover wanted to be a writer, among other things. He would issue press releases saying that I've been up all night answering constituent mail, that read kind of like confessions of romantic literary desire. I can't let my pen go. So, yes?
So, does FBI taking whole task of censorship in the United States?
Censorship, yes.
Generally, not only to black people, but to anybody.
Yeah. Well, this is slightly different than censorship. This is the American version of censorship in which you flood the marketplace. Okay? You flood the marketplace with forms of opposition, but also counter-literature and counter-representation and so on. Was there an attempt to sort of censor through the back door, censor implicitly? Yes. It didn't work that well, I would say. It was a very leaky form of censorship. Right, but there was a patchwork of attempts on the part of Hoover and other FBI people to have the Sedition Act come back into being beyond 1918 to 1923, right? Hoover was always looking for a way to criminalize the word. It never quite happened. He criminalized other things. So I would just say that, when we think about censorship, we're talking about shutting down modes of aesthetic communication. I think Hoover tried to jam those, to reproduce them, to turn them into his own operation. But it's not quite censorship as we know it. Yeah?
Yeah, I remember a radio program from, I think, the late 40s called the FBI in Peace and War.
Yeah, there were a lot of those, yeah.
Was that a FBI-sponsored program?
Yes. Yes, in fact, there's a book called The FBI in Peace and War. Guess who helped to write that book? Okay, so part of this is a question of royalties, right? When I say write the book, that meant that Hoover had some of his agents write it under his name, who would then sometimes argue about the master of deceit, they called him, who wrote Masters, of Deceit, because he was in fact not the person who produced these books. Instead of letting his agents share in the royalties, he would cut them a Christmas check, right? But the FBI was an agency of culture to a great extent. It was a monitor of culture. It was a producer of culture. It penetrated American culture in all sorts of ways. And it had a particularly strong and sort of vigorous and an odd relationship to African American culture in particular. When Hoover gets to the Bureau in 1919, the Washington race riots, there were race riots in Chicago in 1919 too, the Red Summer race riots, are something that he sees on his way to work on the sidewalk in front of the White House. And when he's originally assigned to crack down on radicalism, his primary fear is that the black and white left is going to join arms. And how does he discover this? He discovers this through action in the street, but also through treatises, poems, documents, some of the earliest writing of the Harlem Renaissance, which is extremely militant writing. I don't know how familiar you are with the earliest doses of the Harlem Renaissance before Harlem becomes a sort of place of fantasy and fun. So, yes?
Well, why do you think there's not a file for Zora Neale Hurston?
For Zora Neale Hurston? There could be a file for Zora Neale Hurston. They just wouldn't tell me that there was. So one thing is happening, the FBI now will do a certain amount of research into this. They are not malevolent. They don't really care about the Cold War history very much anymore. If I requested something about contemporary writing about radical Islam, there'd be a very different kind of reaction. But when I say that there might be a file on Zora Neale Hurston, I mean to say that they only go so deep in their research. Some files have been mislaid. A number of older files have been brought to the National Archives. The FBI does not always present the National Archives with the numeration that's necessary to pick certain files. So the National Archives is where American history is supposed to go and supposed to be readable, but in many cases it's where it goes to be buried. Right? So it is possible that Zora Neale Hurston has a file. That's a prolegomena. Now, why does she not have a file? I mean, there are at least 20 or so African-American women writers, right, who have files, but not Zora Neale Hurston. In the imagination of the FBI, this tended to be a war of G-men versus black men. This was a kind of masculine combat throughout the years. And Zora Neale Hurston was a political conservative by the 1940s, certainly, in relationship particularly to the question of communism. She's a radical in many other ways. She's an aesthetic radical. She's a brilliant writer. But when it comes to the American political landscape, she's more on the side of J. Edgar Hoover than some others, right? So, yes?
You mentioned that it was disappointing that your father didn't have a file.
Well, my father, William J. Maxwell Sr.? No, I mean, he was somebody who liked to bail campus radicals out of jail and probably had a more aggrandized sense of his own danger than he actually had. I mean, he's a lovely person who I admire in many, many ways, who was certain that the FBI was tapping his phone after the Cambodia adventure, as I think he might not have been wrong there, but did not have his own file. Like I said, different scholars, different individuals. By the way, all of you can write to the FBI and request your own file. Have you done this? Okay. One thing you can do, and I will seriously entertain this, you look for my email. I owe you something after the beginning of this. But anyway, write me at WashU, right? Send me your emails, and I will send you a template document that you can use to request your own FBI file. Now, for very good reasons, if you're a third party, you can't request the FBI file of somebody who's not you. Okay? Or if that person is still alive, if the person is deceased and a matter of history, then you can request the file. So that's the story there. So you can all request your FBI files. Yeah?
Can I talk a bit about Langston Hughes?
Yes, okay. Langston Hughes, one of the FBI's favorite black writers. It's a relatively early file from the 1920s, and then it moves forward. Langston Hughes says something that really piques the FBI's interest, which is black writing is growing international in focus. And the FBI quotes that again and again and again. So one of the reasons that the FBI winds up in Black Paris in the 1940s is because inadvertently Langston Hughes has tipped them off. Some of these files are, meshes of misinformation, bad reporting. Some of it's incredibly insightful. But some of the Langston Hughes file is just, he's living in this street in Harlem now. he's moved away. But they're fascinated with tracking his many travels, right? They're worried in various ways about his ability to project a black radical writing across the world. And so, he's an instance, there are many others in which the FBI is primarily worried with the question of dissemination, where black writing is going. I'm sure that Langston Hughes knew that he was an FBI suspect, because everyone he was hanging out with was too. So, yes?
How close to the 34 days of Sullivan was the actual death of King? Was it?
Oh, that's years later. That's years later. Okay, so, but some of the people in the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference Brain Trust, who received this letter, in part because of its enmity, were pretty suspicious about the FBI's involvement. Do you know who the FBI assigned to investigate the death of King? Do you know who the lead agent was? Sullivan. It was William C. Sullivan, which didn't precise. I'm not trying to start a conspiracy theory. I mean, there's actually another one. But, there was a fairly rigorous congressional investigation of all this in the 1980s, and I do not believe that the FBI was responsible for that murder. But it didn't really impress the folks at the SCLC that Sullivan, they didn't know he wrote the letter, but they knew his involvement in COINTELPRO was the person who was the lead investigator. And the FBI glommed onto the idea that it had solved the case and found, James Earl Ray, but in fact, it was the Canadian Mounted Police who did the real work there. So, yes?
You talked about Hoover and FDR. How about Hoover and LBJ?
Oh, okay.
I'm sure he loved gossip.
Yes, they had, okay. LBJ, who could, herd cats, right, of all sorts, and glad-hand anyone into almost anything, actually glad-handed Hoover into a more aggressive stance, at least for a number of years, when it came to investigating those who were attempting to murder the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement, right? The famous Mississippi burning killings of, the people who went down for the Freedom Summer. LBJ had to browbeat Hoover into investigating that, but it did in fact work. They also shared certain tastes, right? They were both big eaters, right? They loved the conjunction of power and gossip and secret information, right? Presidents and FBI directors have always enjoyed that, right? They are birds of a feather that way, so. Yes?
Any insights into the current state of the FBI and even its relationship between the executive branch and the current FBI, what's going on now?
What any particular insight? I have no particular insight into that. I'm not worried about the FBI. I am not worried about the FBI's involvement in American literary culture. I'm more worried about other agencies and other tendencies. Like I said, this NSA program of massive reading, in which all of us sitting in this room, right, have been surveyed. Right? In terms of massive patterns of data that will never disappear. We're in that system, I don't find it a personal threat on some existential level. I mean, it has to do with the fact that we're all now involved with, monitoring ourselves through the media and through internet communication. But
another question I had was about who was funding black artists in the early years. Did you see any attempts to dig into their, I know about the Rosenwald Fund in the early years of the period.
Yeah. Well, in addition to investigating all of these African American literary figures, the FBI maintained massive files and sometimes counterintelligence programs in relationship to the NAACP, right, which was a major sponsor of the Harlem Renaissance. The main magazine of the Harlem Renaissance, one of them was The Crisis, which was the NAACP's journal, and you know who edited that, right? W.E.B. Du Bois, right? So this is where black politics and black literature come together quite neatly. I don't think that there were attempts to defund these organizations, but the FBI always imagines that black literature and black politics have an especially tight relationship, and I think they're right about that. That's okay. So, sir, yeah.
What are the goals of the FBI in these efforts, and how successful do you think they were in achieving these goals?
Yeah, okay. I think one goal was to know everything, right? I mean, one thing that's sometimes said about knowing everything is one thing that's sometimes said about the CIA, that it's this mind of America. I think the FBI attempted to become that as well. To know, they wanted to have complete knowledge of the literary landscape. Not at every moment in its history, certainly in the Cold War, when Hoover begins to get the sort of full medicine of the opposition, right? There are publications that begin targeting the FBI. At that moment, there's a sort of program that I call total literary awareness, this effort to discover proof of where black writing is going even before it goes there. So lots of young writers begin to be monitored by the FBI, right? There's a poet named Lance Jeffers, right? He's not all that well known. Do you know Lance Jeffers? Trudeau Harris called him a black nationalist without a movement. He's sort of associated with the Black Arts Movement, though he was not in those inner circles. There are FBI agents who are monitoring his credit hours at Columbia University in the writing program. There's a desire to sort of know what's going to happen before it happens, because the American left and American literature at that moment begin to fire back. So does that answer some of the questions?
Well, I guess more specifically, what did they think was going to happen, if they don't monitor these writers, then everyone's going to give up on the American project, or it's going to nurture radicals who are going to commit acts of terrorism, or question mark?
They're not worried about terrorism. They're worried about an American left in which the black left and the white left actually bury the hatchet, right? And attempt to remake the country. They're worried also about the Communist Party. And the Communist Party, the American Communist Party, for all of its major faults, was a relatively colorblind, almost perforce colorblind organization for many years of its history. So they're worried about communism, which is almost for them synonymous with interracialism. That's one of the things they want to know about. And, knowing that much becomes seductive, right? The patterns that you see in FBI files of the routing of information are intricate and kind of profound, right? If you're interested in the study of bureaucracy, looking at these FBI files can be fascinating. All of it winds up on Hoover's desk at some point during the day. I have no idea how that one could actually manage that level, but it's extraordinary. So there's a desire to know everything for its own pleasure as well. But I think, they're primarily worried about the building of an American left that is popular enough to dominate the culture of the country. And particularly an interracial left is terrifying to the Bureau. And particularly an interracial left that's associated with the Communist Party. And many African American writers, particularly of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, had youthful orientations and experiences in young communist leagues, wrote through the through the John Reed clubs. Chicago had a very strong history of this kind of relationship in particular. Chicago is one of the places where these groups are coming together. Yeah?
Discovering a relationship between black literature and Jewish literature during this time?
Is there a relationship? Well, I mean, we have Bob Kaufman, who's a black Jewish writer. There's that. A great majority of the folks involved in the literary culture of the Communist Party, Mike Gold and others, are themselves Jewish Americans. Is Hoover upset by that particular case? Not overtly in the documents that I see, right? The Hoover Bureau was not the most virulently and overtly racist organization, even in the American government, as far as I know. It was the most dangerous, right? But that's something else. So, yes.
So Hoover obviously believed in the power of the written word, and so I guess this was very driven by him. Was he correct? Like, were African American writers truly this influential, and if so, which ones were the real?
Okay, well, let's think about the history that he lives through. He comes up into the Bureau during the period of the Harlem Renaissance, right, where a modernized, self-defending, aesthetically free African American identity is first advertised widely, right? And the Harlem Renaissance is a commercial success. There are best-selling novels associated with it. During the 1930s, when black writing does not disappear at all, but goes under other colors, other forms, the FBI is mostly interested in white American writing, right? John Dos Passos and others have long files during this period But then there's the black arts movement, right, in which it looks like African American writing is going to hit the street in ways and power the Black Power movement. So I think that they were quite just and pretty intelligent about understanding the power of black writing, both to influence a sense of American identity in the case of the Harlem Renaissance and to help to translate into commercial success. And then during the Black Power movement, the absolute, conjunction or identity between black power politics and black arts aesthetics, to the extent that Amiri Baraka, right, who's powerful both on the political side and on the aesthetic side, is in the FBI's mind during that period the leading candidate for the position of Black Messiah. I don't think that's an actual position, but this is the sort of thing that the FBI is wearing. So I mean, I think that they're right about the power of this possible alliance.
We can take one more question.
Okay, sir.
She wasn't black and she wasn't known for her novels and short stories, but I imagine you ran across the file on Eleanor Roosevelt. And I'd be curious if you did, what you saw, and then second, anything on the members of the Roosevelt administration.
Yeah, I have not myself seen those files, right? But Eleanor was where racial progressivism enters the White House during that period. I am almost certain that Hoover was deeply involved and interested in Eleanor Roosevelt. I know that FBI agents didn't like her as much as they liked FDR. But I don't know the extent of that file. But you can do your own research into this. You can file for these files. And the FBI has its own online library called The Vault, where there are, it's called The Vault. You can look it up. It's a US government website. You can download pretty decent copies of the files of many famous Americans. And there's a whole history of the 20th century that's embedded in that vault. It's no longer a secret history. So. Paul Robeson. Yes. Oh, the FBI loathed Paul Robeson and helped to take away his passport. It also helped to remove the passport of W.E.B. Du Bois, Shirley Graham Du Bois, Harold Cruse, who wrote The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. I discovered lots of evidence of scouting through passports for potentially abusable irregularities or filing mistakes. But a regular FBI instrument would be to attempt to withdraw a passport and to chart travel patterns through passports. During the 1930s and 1940s, Hoover occasionally would volunteer the FBI to become the passport agency, which didn't quite happen. But
why did you only get 51 out of 106?
Well, because sometimes you miss, I guess. But I mean, 51 out of 106 strikes me as that's 48%, right? I can do that much math. And that strikes me as a pretty high hit rate, right, for a bunch of people who are known for publishing as opposed to, say, taking up arms against the government, right? So, okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay.